The room had not changed since that late autumn evening in 1994, or at least that was how it felt every time I stepped inside its dim outline. The corridor outside hummed with the muted rhythm of old ventilation, the kind that belonged to structures built before digital clocks and silent thermostats. Inside, the stillness held its own gravity, thicker than the dust on the metal filing cabinets or the faint scent of aged paper that clung to everything like a memory refusing to fade. The case had slept here for years, cocooned in cardboard and silence, untouched except for routine audits that meant nothing to the truth buried within. Time had preserved it, not kindly but faithfully, as if waiting for a return that had taken far too long. Her name had been Liora Kensell, age 28, a graduate student who worked nights at a small archival office near the university. A quiet life, modest, grounded. No complications anyone could confirm. I remember the early reports describing her presence as orderly, focused, and rarely in dispute with anyone. Words that made her vanish on paper even before she vanished in reality. Yet those who knew her had spoken about a gentle confidence, subtle, steady, the kind that grew in the spaces between sentences. She was the kind of person who noticed forgotten history, categorized it, protected it. Ironically, her own story had slipped into obscurity, unfinished and unanswered. The old scene where she had been found, no disturbance apart from her absence of breath, had long since been repurposed into a storage wing. Still, when I walked through it, I could sense the echo of that first night. The lonely desk lamp casting a narrow cone of light, the unfiled documents on the wooden surface, the clock whose hands had continued moving though everything else had stopped. Back then, I was younger, convinced that careful work always led to clear endings. I hadn't yet learned how silence could mimic truth, or how details chosen too early could mislead an entire direction. When I re-entered today, the dust responded first, rising in a soft cloud as if surprised by company. I moved slowly, not because the floorboards creaked, but because the room deserved caution. These remnants were the closest thing to witnesses left. The weight of their quiet mattered. I touched nothing at first, only let the memory sit, expanding into the low light. "Still the same," I whispered, the words thin, almost reluctant. A shadow of reply lingered in the air but carried no sound. Faint fluorescent light flickered above, its rhythm irregular, casting brief tremors across the floor. With every pulse I saw her workspace as it once was, the chair slightly angled, the notebooks arranged with precise spacing, a coffee cup with a small chip along the rim. I remembered staring at that cup during the initial review, thinking the chip might mean something. It hadn't, or so we believed. Back then, the lead investigator dismissed it with a quiet, "not relevant." I'd nodded, though some part of me had hesitated. Small things often held the weight of larger truths, if only one looked closely enough. Liora's file had sat on my conscience for decades, not loudly, not painfully, but steadily, like a closed door I kept walking past. The official status, undetermined. The unofficial understanding, no direction forward, no suspect strong enough, no reason to reopen a case that had already consumed months of inquiry. The absence of progress had settled into the record like sediment. Yet standing here again, all that old stillness felt charged, as if the air remembered something we had not known how to ask. I moved toward the metal cabinet where the original evidence box had once been stored. The cabinet door groaned softly when I opened it, revealing only unrelated archives now. Still, the memory of the box felt intact, the weight of it, the corners worn from handling. I closed my eyes for a moment, recalling its contents. A thin scarf, a set of keys, several small photographs, a half-filled notebook, a printout of her work schedule, and a report documenting the position she'd last been in. Nothing pointed in a direction strong enough to hold. Nothing spoke above a whisper. This room had become a monument to that uncertainty. But as I stood there in its low light, I sensed that the silence had shifted, not broken but stirred. Something had changed since the last time I visited. Something subtle. A reason to be here again after all these years. And it wasn't memory pulling me back. It was evidence, new, unexpected, and quietly disruptive. The kind of evidence that nudged a frozen story back into motion. 2. Case reopens due to discovery of new crucial evidence. The call had come 2 weeks earlier, brief but precise. A routine transfer of campus materials, a forgotten storage locker at the old archival annex, and inside it, among boxes marked for disposal, an envelope sealed with a label that didn't match any cataloging system used in 1994. A graduate assistant sorting through the materials had noticed the discrepancy. Inside the envelope was a single item that should never have been missing from the original case file. A photograph. Not just another picture of Liora at her desk or walking across campus, the kind we had plenty of. This one was taken in the final week before her death. It showed her standing near the entrance of the annex, holding a folder close, her expression neutral except for the faint tightening around her eyes. But the real discovery was not her expression. It was the shadow behind her, long, angled, positioned in a way that suggested someone else had been near her at the time. Someone we had never identified. The original case file contained no such photo. That alone warranted reopening the investigation. But there was more. The envelope included a short note, typed unsigned. This should have been part of the record, found late, do not ignore. The message was simple, almost mechanical, yet it carried an unmistakable urgency. Someone had known this photo mattered. Someone had kept it, intentionally or by fear until now. And someone believed the truth was still salvageable. The department reviewed the submission protocol, confirmed chain of custody inconsistencies, and by the end of the day, the cold case unit was fully engaged. I volunteered to lead. No hesitation, no second thoughts. Some cases return because they never left. When I saw the photograph for the first time, I studied the edges, the grain, the faint smudge near the lower right corner. I held it by its sides, letting its surface remain untouched. The faint smell of old storage, dust, paper, time clung to it. The shadow behind Liora was elongated, likely cast by the exterior light fixtures, but the shape suggested more than a passerby. The positioning implied proximity, awareness, intent. I placed the photo under a magnifying lens, analyzing the distortion of light near the shadow's edge. Not much could be extracted with clarity, but the angle of the shadow indicated height, approximate build, and the direction of approach. The physical environment around the annex entrance allowed for only a few positions from which a figure could cast such a shape. This wasn't just a missing asset, it was a missing piece of logic. And it changed everything. My first task was to reconstruct the final verified timeline of Liora's movements. Her last confirmed sighting had been earlier the same day the photo was taken. A coworker had seen her leaving with a folder, the same one she held in the picture. But the folder had never been recovered. The new photo placed her at the annex later than initially recorded. This meant the timeline had a gap that had been overlooked. I visited the storage annex where the photo was taken. The building had aged, but its structure remained consistent. The exterior lights, though replaced, cast shadows at similar angles. I stood near the entrance, holding the printout of the recovered image, aligning the angles, imagining her standing exactly as she had, holding her folder. I pictured the silent approach of the second presence, the shadow falling against the wall before any sound betrayed it. A faint chill moved through the air, subtle but enough to brush memory. I whispered, "We missed this." The annex was quiet, only the hum of old heating lines in the distance. My steps felt heavy as I walked down the narrow hallway where Liora had often worked. The faint scent of cardboard and soft dust clung to everything. I imagined her here on that day, focused, absorbed in the task of preserving records. Always one more file, one more detail worth keeping safe. The new evidence forced the case open by necessity, not nostalgia. It gave shape to an unseen presence. It turned silence into direction, and it reignited the obligation to understand what had happened. The photograph wasn't proof of guilt. It wasn't even proof of danger, but it was proof of proximity. And proximity demands scrutiny. 3 investigator examines, past reports to identify overlooked details. I returned to the old case file with a different mindset, not searching for what had been recorded, but for what the documents did not say. Silence often reveals what speech conceals. I spread the reports across the table, arranging them chronologically, then by relevance, then by thematic patterns, movements, objects, statements, environmental observations. The first page that drew my attention again was the initial scene description. I had read it dozens of times over the years, always finding it thorough yet curiously hollow. Now, with the photograph fresh in mind, I noticed the emphasis on the absence of forced entry, the absence of disturbance, the absence of any documented presence other than hers. The report leaned heavily on negation, a pattern of what was not there. I read the officer's note slowly, tracing each sentence with my fingertip. Desk lamp on. Documents aligned. Chair slightly angled from workspace. Window closed, blinds halfway shut. All items accounted for except personal folder. That last line had always bothered me. A missing folder in an environment dedicated to preservation wasn't an accident. Liora was methodical. If she left with a folder, she meant to keep it with her, not misplace it or abandon it. I moved to the witness statements. Coworkers, neighbors, students, most carried the same tone: respect, mild affection, calm familiarity, nothing indicating conflict. Yet in one brief interview, a colleague had mentioned she had been preoccupied with a specific set of documents in the week before her death. The statement had been dismissed because no documents matching that description were recovered. But now, the folder in the photograph resurfaced the question: what had she been reviewing? Next, I examined the item logs. The chipped coffee cup, the keys, the notebook. The chipped cup had always been considered irrelevant, but a detail in the log caught my attention now. The chip was recent. The glaze around it showed no discoloration, no accumulated dust. It had happened not long before she died. Such a detail didn't point to guilt, but it suggested interruption, an abrupt moment, something that shifted her hand, her attention, her balance. I lifted the notebook carefully. Her handwriting was neat, spaced evenly, but the final few entries showed subtle changes in pressure. A slight increase, a rhythm that hinted at urgency or distraction. One line, written faintly, read: Archive cross-reference incomplete. Must verify origin. Origin of what? Another missing detail. The scent of old paper rose as I flipped through the pages, the soft rasp of each sheet adding to the quiet. The weight of the notebook felt different now, less like an artifact and more like a partial message. Then I noticed an overlooked attachment in the file, a small document folded into the back sleeve of the report. I unfolded it with gloved fingers. It was a printout from the Annex's entry log system. The timestamps showed Liora entering at a time consistent with the original timeline. But the exit log was blank for that same period, as if the system had failed to register her departure. An error or something more deliberate. The old system had been known to glitch, but rarely without leaving partial data. I leaned back, studying the sheet, letting the details settle. Something small but meaningful was emerging, a pattern of overlooked irregularities, a missing folder, a recent chip in the cup, a faint change in handwriting, an exit log that didn't align, and now the shadow in the photograph. None of these alone pointed directly to a person, but together they created a map of subtle interference, an intrusion that had gone unnoticed. I organized the documents again, this time grouping them by anomalies. The structure of the case began to shift, not dramatically, but quietly, logically, like a puzzle realigning itself once a single misplaced piece is corrected. And in that subtle shifting, a new direction formed. Not loud, not obvious, but present. A direction I would follow next, toward the people connected to Liora's last week. Toward the motives hidden not in conflict, but in quiet tension. Toward the truth that had waited decades for the right detail to surface. The next stage required speaking to the people whose names had appeared in the original file, some briefly, some repeatedly, some only in passing. After decades, their lives had shifted, but memory has a way of preserving certain shadows even when details fade. I approached each interview with quiet precision, asking only what was necessary, listening for the pauses more than the answers. The first person of interest was Evan Halberg, a former colleague who had shared office space with Liora during evening hours. His initial statement from 1994 had described their working relationship as neutral, professional. Nothing unusual, but the new photograph placed someone near her close to the time she was last seen. Evan was one of the few individuals whose schedule regularly overlapped with hers. He received me politely, his voice subdued, his posture slightly guarded. "I don't remember much," he said, eyes shifting toward the window. "It's been a long time." I observed the small tension in his hands, the slight tremor when he folded them. His hesitation didn't imply guilt, only discomfort. Still, something about his phrasing struck me as practiced, the way people speak when they've protected a memory long enough that it becomes polished rather than honest. When I showed him the photograph, he leaned closer. "She looks focused," he murmured. "In the shadow?" I asked. He hesitated, the air settled. "Could be anyone." His tone carried a trace of unease, not fear. Unease can come from truth or from the effort to appear truthful. His alibi from the original report placed him at a departmental gathering across campus. Several attendees had confirmed his presence. That alibi still stood strong, but his expression while looking at the photograph lingered in my mind long after I left his office. The second person was Marla Renshaw, a close friend and classmate of Liora. In the early reports, she had described Liora as quiet but dedicated, adding that she had seemed distracted by some research project near the end. Marla now worked in a different state but agreed to speak by appointment during a visit to Ohio. Her eyes softened when she heard Liora's name. "She worked too hard," she said, her voice low. "Sometimes I worried she was carrying something she didn't talk about." I asked about the week leading to Liora's death. Marla frowned, searching her memory. She mentioned something about misfiled documents, said it could change the way a certain project was understood, but she didn't explain what she meant. A new detail, subtle but meaningful. Marla had no motive, and her alibi, from classmates and timestamps, had remained clean from the beginning. But her insight provided context. Liora had been pursuing something in those final days, something requiring quiet focus and caution. The third name from the file belonged to Jonas Marin, a custodian who had worked the evening shift near the archival wing. His original statement had been brief but consistent. He recalled seeing Liora working late, mentioned she always left the place orderly. Jonas greeted me with a tired smile, his voice steady but older now. "I always thought she was kind," he said, "never caused trouble." When I asked if he remembered anyone near the Annex entrance around the time the photo was taken, he paused, thinking carefully. "Hard to say. People came and went, students, staff, a few I didn't know." "Anyone lingering?" Another pause. "Maybe someone tall, quiet. Stood near the entrance one evening, but that could have been before or after. Hard to place." The vague recollection aligned with the shadow's height. Enough to raise interest, not enough to direct blame. Finally, there was Ronan Field, a visiting researcher whose temporary project had overlapped with Liora's schedule. His name appeared only twice in the older reports. He had been interviewed briefly, his presence deemed unrelated. But the timeline of his departure from the university happened shortly after Liora's death. The coincidence had never been probed deeply. Ronan answered my questions with calm efficiency, each response shaped neatly, as if he had rehearsed long ago. "I had no connection to her work," he said. "We barely exchanged words." His gaze, however, stayed fixed, direct, unwavering, precise. Some people protect their truth with silence, others with structure. His alibi from the 1994 report placed him in a lab across campus during the relevant time frame. Verification had been solid, but he remembered more about Liora than his initial statement suggested. "She was disciplined," he said. "People like her often notice things others miss." The comment followed me out the door. It felt less like admiration and more like observation. Each person carried a fragment of truth. Each carried an alibi strong enough to remain intact. Yet each also held a small gap, a moment, a detail that felt slightly misaligned. Not enough for accusation, but enough for suspicion. I gathered these fragments carefully, arranging them alongside the anomalies from the old reports. Together, they formed a quiet constellation, subtle, faint, yet directional. In the center of that constellation was Liora herself. Her final days, her last decisions, her unspoken focus. Whatever she had been working on had drawn someone close, and that proximity had left a shadow. 5. Clues emerged slowly, linking inconsistencies to emotional conflicts. The next phase was patient, methodical. No sudden breakthroughs, only gradual clarity forming at the edges of what had once been dismissed as background noise. I reviewed the new photograph again, this time comparing it with the environmental logs from the Annex. The angle of the shadow suggested evening light, meaning the timestamp of her presence was later than initially believed. This contradicted two early witness estimates, which placed her departure before dusk. Inconsistency 1. Time of presence. I turned to the chipped coffee cup recorded in the evidence logs. The break was recent, superficial, but the placement of the cup on her desk, perfectly aligned with her notes, indicated she had not been startled when it happened. A chipped cup from a sudden disruption would have been accompanied by displacement, papers disturbed, chair shifted. Instead, everything had remained orderly. The only disturbance had been the cup itself. Inconsistency 2. Disruption without chaos. This suggested the chip occurred earlier, quietly, perhaps during a conversation. A moment that changed nothing outwardly but signaled something inward. Hesitation, concern, subtle tension. A quiet conflict, not an overt one. Next, the missing folder. It had been in her hands in the recovered photograph, but it was not found at the scene, nor anywhere in the Annex during the initial investigation. Inconsistency 3. absent object central to her final hours. Folders do not vanish without intent, either her own or someone else. I cross-referenced every custodial, administrative, and departmental log from that period. One entry stood out: a maintenance request submitted a day after her death, citing minor disruption to a storage shelf in the Annex. The request had been marked completed but carried no explanation for what caused the disruption. Inconsistency 4. Post-event correction without documentation. Small, forgettable, but perhaps meaningful in hindsight. I arranged the inconsistencies into a single progression. 1. She stayed later than documented. 2. Something caused subtle tension before she died. 3. The folder she protected went missing. 4. A shelf was adjusted after the event, without reason. When placed together, they formed a pattern connected not to violence, but to caution, an emotional conflict, a tension involving information, discovery, and the fear of being misunderstood or interrupted. Marla's comment about misfiled documents returned to mind. Liora had been reviewing something that needed verification, something she believed significant. If that folder contained data contradicting previous work or exposing an error in someone else's research, it could have caused quiet friction, not hostility, but anxiety, fear of impact, fear of professional scrutiny. The suspects' interviews aligned with this. Evan's subtle tension, Ronan's oddly structured responses, Marla's memory of Liora's concern, Jonas's recollection of a tall figure near the entrance. Each detail threaded into the next, weaving a picture of a conflict not rooted in anger, but in something quieter: misunderstanding, pressure, concern over reputations and work. This conflict would not have produced sudden, dramatic confrontation, but it could have drawn someone close enough to cast a shadow in that photograph. Someone who believed they needed to speak with her. Someone who believed they needed to retrieve that folder. Someone who did not realize how fragile a moment could become. The truth, I sensed, was smaller than we imagined, not grand, not sensational. But small things often lead to irreversible outcomes. 6. Unexpected twist reveals the least suspected person as killer. Twists do not arrive with force. They reveal themselves through quiet logic, one detail aligning with another until the shape becomes undeniable. It began with the entry log error. Originally dismissed as a system glitch, the missing exit timestamp for Liora now appeared purposeful. The old logbook was analog, its digital entries manually verified by custodial staff. One staff member from that era had remained employed at the university part-time, Jonas Marin. I returned to speak with him calmly, without accusation. When I asked about the entry logs, his expression shifted, not fear but a slow, inward consideration, as if he had been expecting the question for years. "The system wasn't perfect," he said softly. "But someone must verify entries manually, correct?" He nodded. "And on that evening, you were the one responsible." A long pause. He lowered his gaze, hands resting motionless on the table. "I remember," he said quietly, "she stayed later than usual." His next words emerged carefully. "I checked the logs before leaving. She was still inside. I didn't correct the exit line." Not an admission of wrongdoing, but something else: responsibility, oversight. "Why not?" I asked. He hesitated, breath settling. "She wasn't alone." Silence filled the space between us, slow and steady. "The person with her," I said. "Who was it?" His voice dropped to a near whisper. Evan, he asked her something. They spoke quietly. She looked uneasy. The revelation shifted everything. Evan's alibi, long believed solid, was intact only for the middle of the evening, not for the final hours. His university gathering had ended earlier than the original report implied. But this was not the twist. The twist came when I returned to the chipped coffee cup. A small detail, a minor thing, but the cup had been placed on the left side of her desk. Liora was right-handed. She always placed her cup on the right. Why would it be on the left that evening? Unless someone else picked it up. Someone who carried it in the left hand. Jonas. A quiet custodian, the least suspected, reliable, soft-spoken, present in the background of every shift, every night. He had access to the Annex. He had the proximity. He had the responsibility over the logs, and his recollection of a tall figure near the entrance could easily have been deflection rather than memory. But motive. It was not anger, not rivalry, not conflict. It was concern. In the final interview, which he offered without hesitation, Jonas explained in a low, steady voice. She was carrying documents that contradicted a restoration project. I overheard conversations. She planned to report it. I thought it would cause trouble for the department. I only meant to talk. She stepped back, lost balance, hit the shelf. A quiet accident. A devastating one. He had panicked, moved the folder, adjusted the shelf, left the scene orderly, logged nothing. He had kept the photograph. All these years. Waiting for the moment when he could no longer keep the truth alone. He was never violent, never driven by harm. Only by fear of consequences. A quiet fear with irreversible weight. The confession did not arrive with urgency, nor with the dramatic tremble one might expect after decades of carrying a hidden truth. It came instead with simple clarity, shaped by time, remorse, and the slow erosion of silence. When Jonas finished speaking, he closed his eyes briefly, as if acknowledging a truth that had always waited patiently behind him. There was no resistance, no denial, no attempt to redirect. Only acceptance. The room felt suspended in a quiet that was neither relief nor dread, something in between, the space where consequence meets understanding. Through the window, late afternoon light stretched across the floor in elongated patterns, the same kind of light that had cast the shadow in the photograph all those years ago. Light exposing what darkness had preserved. I collected the remaining pieces carefully, not rushing. Every detail mattered even now, especially now. Jonas walked me through the final minutes of Liora's life with a soft, measured tone, careful but not defensive. He explained how he had approached her, intending only to speak about the folder she carried. To him, the documents represented potential disruption in a project the department valued deeply. He feared the implications, the questions, the pressure that might follow, not conflict, consequence. She didn't want to talk, he said quietly. Not then. She stepped back. I reached out. She moved the shelf. He paused, swallowing the memory instead of describing it. The simplicity of it struck me. No calculated harm, no premeditation. A moment shaped by misunderstanding, pressure, and fear. A moment so small it could have passed unnoticed in any other context, but small moments can alter everything. The collision of caution and hesitation, the subtle shift of weight, the narrow space between two people who did not expect danger. I documented his statement fully, my notes meticulous. The pen moved steadily but felt heavier with each line. The air held a faint scent of old varnish and dust, a reminder of how many times I had sat in similar rooms, listening to stories that filled silence with explanations that never truly repaired the voids they left behind. Justice is procedural, truth is personal. They rarely align neatly. When it was over, Jonas looked at the floor, his hands resting motionless on the table. "She deserved clarity," he said. It wasn't a plea, it was an acknowledgement. And he was right. Clarity, not closure, not redemption, was what had been missing all these years. The next steps unfolded with mechanical precision. Forms, signatures, transfer protocols. Each part of the system moved forward as expected, its processes practiced and emotionless, built to handle complexities without absorbing them. I watched the procedure unfold with a kind of detachment, the same kind that had guided me through countless investigations. But beneath the detachment was something quieter, heavier, a recognition that the truth we had uncovered, though accurate, did not feel triumphant. Truth rarely does. When the formalities were complete, I returned to the cold case room one last time. The familiar scent of paper and dust greeted me, steady and unchanged. The boxes along the wall stood like small, silent sentinels, each containing fragments of stories paused midway, waiting for clarity that might never come. I walked to the corner where Liora's file had slept for decades. The folder containing the new photograph rested beside it now, a final piece completing a story that had remained fractured for too long. I opened the file gently. Her documented life unfolded before me, transcripts, notes, soft pencil marks on the edges of archival sheets. The routine details of someone who had lived with purpose even in quiet spaces. She had cared about accuracy, about preservation, about ensuring that the past was understood correctly. The irony of her own story being misfiled by time was not lost on me. I traced a finger over the typed report summarizing the case as it now stood. Death by unintended causes, a clinical phrase, a precise phrase, yet it carried no measure of who she was or how the days leading to her final moments had felt for her. There was no record of the small concerns she might have carried home at night. No documentation of her final thoughts, only the facts, arranged with order but without her voice. That absence lingered more heavily than any unanswered question. I placed the photograph beside the file and studied it once more. Liora standing at the Annex entrance, holding the folder close, expression calm but focused. Behind her, the shadow, not Jonas's silhouette, as we later confirmed, but the environmental distortion of someone tall walking past the exterior light fixture. A misdirection that had never been intentional. A misinterpretation carried through decades. The truth was smaller than we expected, yet heavier than it appeared. I closed the file gently and stepped back, letting the stillness of the room settle around me. The lights hummed faintly overhead. A subtle draft moved along the floor, stirring the thinnest veil of dust. Time seemed to pause, an echo of the first night I had stood in this room, searching for answers I didn't yet know how to see. We want truth to arrive with clarity, with certainty, with a sense of justice balancing itself. But truth often arrives quietly, shaped by fragile moments, human hesitation, and details so small they disappear when viewed too quickly. It is not always visible on the surface. It does not always fit into the frameworks we build for it. I gathered my things slowly, giving the room a final glance. Her name, Liora Kensell, rested on the folder spine, steady, simple, unembellished. A reminder that every case, no matter how old, is not merely an investigation but a life remembered, shaped by the choices of others and their unintended weight. As I stepped into the hallway, I felt neither victory nor closure, only a quiet acknowledgement that justice, in its structured form, had been served. Yet something human remained unresolved, the sense that truth, once uncovered, does not mend what time has taken. It only illuminates the path that led there. The corridor lights flickered briefly, then steadied. I moved down the hallway, each step measured, the echoes soft against the worn floor. Behind me, the cold case room returned to its stillness, holding its stories as it always had, waiting, watching, remembering. Truth had surfaced, finally. Not triumphantly. Not dramatically. Simply, quietly, like a detail found in the corner of an old document when one looks slowly enough. And as I walked away, the final reflection settled with me. In the end, truth is never hidden far, just deeper than we choose to look.